Hey there folks, this is Myron again, just coming back to you with some more Material UI. We've got what we went over last time, which was just setup, and we added like some buttons some places, just to show you how to like import the different components and how to sift through some of the documentation here on Material. We're going to dig a little bit deeper now. We're going to talk about layout. So I've got something here that's just sort of doing these 4 blocks and then just sort of wrapping in 4 more blocks, etc., etc., etc. It just keeps on wrapping. Now, the major layout component inside of Material UI is the grid. Now, this is pretty consistent with any kind of third-party styling library. There's going to be some sort of grid in place. And Material UI is no exception. Material UI's grid works on the same format that just about every other grid works on. And that's a 12-column grid. Basically meaning that the full width of something is 12 columns. Now, columns can span various distances between that 12 columns. For example, this one right here is spanning full 12 columns. Here is 6 columns, giving it 50% of the space, and then another 6 columns, giving it another 50% of the space, and then 3 columns down here, breaking it up into 4s. The way Material UI handles that sizing is with this XS attribute. Now, I'm not going to touch on breakpoints just yet. That gets into some responsive design concepts. I'll be getting into some responsive design concepts in the next set of videos. For right now, I want to talk about grids. So the grid here, if we look at the overall structure, we've got one component grid, and that's all that's required to put the grid in place. The big things to be aware of here are the container attribute and the item attribute. The container attribute needs to be on the grid that's wrapping all of these other grids. So that's the outermost grid component. And then inside of it, each section that represents this span of columns should be another grid component. This grid component, however, needs the attribute or prop of item. So it just has to be in place. We don't need to give it any value. We just have to put item on the grid component. And then we'll mess around with some other properties, but those are our major 2 properties, and they have to be in that order. I have a grid component wrapping all of my columns that have the prop of item on them. Now we're going to jump over to our site here, and we're going to toss in some grid. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to toss in some grid on here and probably some grid down here on edit, right? So that we get all of the thing kind of laid out. So we've got some nice structure. Now I'm going to go through and I'm going to explain what I'm doing here, and then I'm going to explain what I'm doing on details, and then you're going to see me just kind of rapid go through things. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, like I said, we just need to import the grid component. It's the only component we need to be able to use grid. Now we have a concept of rows and columns, right? The row is our grid container, and then the column is our grid item. Now, under the hood, the grid is using flexbox, which makes our grid super powerful and gives us a lot of options. Now, we don't have to worry about the options just yet, but we will in just a little bit here. So I'm going to go ahead and close out my item. I'm going to close out edit and details, and we're going to jump over into, apologies, I imported grid into here. This is not where I need to import grid. I actually need to get grid coming out in the list, because this is where everything's actually listed out. Now right now I'm using a UL, which is okay. That's fairly semantic, right? It's a list of all of our creatures. But I'm going to change it out because I want to work with the grid components. So if I consider this my outermost wrapping, this should be my grid container. And then my LIs should absolutely be my individual grid cells. Now, how much we want the cells to span, that's going to be up to us. But let's go ahead and get this in here. As is with everything, I need to import it first. And I'm going to go ahead and use that syntax right off the bat because I'm probably going to need some additional components in here at some point. And then we'll use grid down below. So UL can become grid, LI can become grid, and I'm going to take this blocks class off of that outermost wrapping. Now our outermost wrapping, like I said, we need the container attribute. Now you could suss this out by looking at the documentation in either API or in the demos, as I've demonstrated before with button, and figure it out. But I'm just sort of rapid helping you figure out, how do I use a grid? So we need the outermost grid to have the attribute or prop of container. And then the grid components inside of that container need to have the grid component, but with an attribute or prop of item. Now right here, this is enough to create a grid. But we're going to jump over to our page and see what's going on when we don't have any sizing. Whoa, it's totally just spanning the entire distance. Now, is this what we want, or are we not happy with this? Like, how are we feeling? Right? Like, that's all up to us. Right now, I'm thinking, well, it's not bad, but I don't really care for how we've got all of such as spanning the whole distance. If I wanted that, I could have just done that from the beginning. So I'm thinking I either want 3 per row, or I want something like maybe 4 per row like we had before. Could do 2 per row. Totally up to us. So now down here, in order to add sizing, we actually want to do span. Now, how Material UI handles span is the smallest size is XS. Now this gets into a little bit of responsive design, but we always want to start at the smallest size and then work our way up. So at the smallest size, and because I'm not going to really worry about mobile right now, I'm just going to worry about what I want it to look like. So I'm going to say XS equals, and then I'm going to open up my curly brackets. Now inside the curly brackets, I'm going to give it some sort of number value. The number value represents a number between 1 and 12, telling us how many columns of that 12-column grid I want this to span. So if I want it to be 50-50 and I only want 2 columns to show up, 50% of 12 is 6. So now my items, 2, 2, 2, 2, right, and so on and so forth, all the way down. Not bad. Now if I want it to go ahead and be 3, I would want it to span 4. So 12 divided by 3 is 4. So I've got 3. Now we could totally try the 4 that we had before, so I need it to be 3. Come back over here, and we have the 4. Now I don't really care for the 4. I'm going to go to the 3, or the 2 is pretty good. So let's go to the 3. That's not bad. So let's settle on here for now. But there's one other thing here that I'm not particularly caring for, and that is we have no space between the items. Now when we looked at our grid over here, this had a nice a little bit of space around everything, which was super nice, right? It gives it a little breathing room, and the content looks like it belongs, rather than over here where things are touching. It looks a little tense there. Now, just a frame of reference. Uh, when you have different elements touching like this, and you don't have space between them, you don't have air for them to breathe, a person viewing this actually gets angry. They don't know that they're getting angry, but they're getting angry. Frustration starts happening. And this is all because of how our brain's perceiving this. So if we want to make sure that somebody's going to enjoy our application, we definitely want to make sure we have breathing room between our different components. So let's go ahead and make sure that this UI has a good amount of breathing room. So how we give some breathing room or space to our grid is we come up to the grid container. Now, grid container has another prop that we pass called spacing. Now, it allows us to pass a numeric value on spacing. And if we come back over to the documentation, you'll notice that this first set. 0 to 10 should allow us spacing. So if I do something like 2, and I come back over to my application, I can see that now there's a nice little bit of spacing in here. Now, depending on how much spacing we want, if we went up to like 6, came back over, we see we have a very large gap. So we want something that's going to be probably around a 2 or 3. Give us a good amount, but we don't want too much. So here, this looks like it's giving us a good amount. Now you'll notice that all of these items are top aligned, meaning that in each set, they're all lining up at the top of the items. This is something we could adjust for with Material UI because the grid is based off of flexbox. And flexbox allows us that kind of adjustment. Now, do I necessarily care about it? Maybe, maybe not. Hard to tell, right? Because I'm not really sure where I want this to sit. One of the things that we kind of would like is all of these are a different height, right? Wouldn't be bad if we could make them all the same height. Flexbox allows us to do this as well, but there's something that we have to keep in mind. The thing that actually looks like it's a different height is the paper, and paper's not part of grid, so paper's not going to be the same height. So this might be a little difficult to actually do. But we'll take a look at it and see if we can accomplish it later on. At this moment, though, I just kind of want to get it to a spot that I like. But I'd like to try playing with the alignment here so I can see how it vertically aligns. So again, we come over to the documentation, and what we want to do is see here. Now, this is interactive, right? So what it's telling us is that we can click on these things to see how it adjusts. Now, that vertical alignment is not align items. That's actually this justify. Well, justify is giving us not the vertical line. So align items is giving us this alignment by item. The justify is giving us, oh, is it at the beginning of the column? Is it at the end of the column? Ooh, are they spread out? Space around? Space evenly? So there's lots of different options there. What we want to look at is the align items, and if we do something like flex start, they're all top aligned. Center aligned. Flex end, they're at the bottom. We've got stretch. This is the one I was talking about that was kind of like doing the whole thing. And then baseline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try flex start, I'm going to try center, and and I'm going to try flex end. See what I like. I'm not really going to worry about stretch or base, because stretch, I don't think I'm really going to see much of a difference. Baseline, probably, again, not going to see much of a difference, because they have a single row here, whereas we have them wrapping. So for us, the thing is going to look just a little bit different. Now, this direction up here, this is telling us the order in which the items are getting placed. And that's for us to decide, but the default is row. So we're going to try and do flex start center and flex end on align items and see how it goes. So for align items, what we do, now just coming down to the example, align items goes on container. We can see that we're on container here. So let's do align items. Now I'm starting to get a few attributes here. I could continue going out horizontally here, but usually once I get to about 3 attributes, I start creating multiple lines so that it's a little bit easier to read and manage. And I don't like side scrolling. So here's our align items attribute. Now I opened up curly brackets, but we really only need the quotations here because we're going to pass it some sort of string value. Now we're getting some wonderful telesense here to tell us what kind of things we can use. But let's try flex start first. We'll save and we'll come over to our site, see how it goes. Okay, so it looks like flex start is kind of where we were at. So let's try flex end. Don't really care for it too much. And then let's give it center. And we can see all of these are centered now. But again, I think I actually liked the top of line the best. Now we can try that stretch, right? Because we had that option as well. If we do the stretch. But again, like I said, we're not really going to see a change with the stretch. The stretch is actually allowing the content to become the full height of whatever's on that particular row. The problem becomes that the things inside of there, paper in particular, that is looking like the wrapping element, the white with the box shadow, that is actually not going to inherit the height of its parent being the grid item. So we'll just do flex start. I think that's our best option. So I've got flex start here, and this is looking pretty good. Not too bad, you know, mostly consistently kind of resembling what we had before. But now I'm going to go ahead and move over to the details and see what I can do with grid over here to kind of help liven this up. Now what I'm kind of thinking that would be nice is to move the picture off to the left and then move these details with name, type, physical description, background, attributes, and habitats off to the right of the image. So we're going to give that a shot and see how that works. First off, let's go ahead and commit. Alright, now let's go ahead and jump over to the details page. So I absolutely want to bring in grid, and we already have button inside of here. So I'm going to make this that deconstruction way of importing so that I can do multiple components. And really it's more so that I can do multiple components with ease. Is there anything dictating that I have to do it this way? Absolutely not. If you prefer the other way, go the other way. Mostly I would let my team kind of dictate how this would go. I personally like it this way, but if they have a good argument the other way, I can be swayed. Alright, so now that we have grid imported, what I'm thinking is I've got my heading here. I've got these buttons up here for navigation. What I wouldn't mind doing is having the heading here with the buttons off to the right. So I'm kind of thinking I'd like a grid around these, splitting that up. So I think I'm going to change the grid, the div here, to my grid, and we'll make that the container. And then I need some stuff wrapping the items. So I'm going to need a grid. So we've got our grid container here with now our grid, and we want to have the buttons be on the right-hand side and the heading to be on the left-hand side. So we need two columns here, basically. What we're going to do is wrap the heading in one of the columns, so one of our grid items. And then the second grid item is going to go around the buttons. Now I haven't added any sizing here, so it's going to want to inherit whatever the sizing of the content of the grid item is. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I'm running my code. So running my server, and then my client side. Now, as this comes up, what we're looking for here is to get this item on the far left side and this item on the far right side. There's going to be a way that we're going to accomplish this, and we'll jump over to Material UI to explore what that is inside of their interface. Because they've got an example there where we were testing alignment options. So let's go over to our details where this is. So we've got these two items here. Now they're trying to top align. If you inspect this element here, you can see that the entire container is that tall, so that's why it's trying to top align. So we want to change our alignments, but we also want to change the spacing. So let's head over to Material UI and I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to look at the grid components. So first off, we want to make sure that it's centered like this. So we're going to need justify center, so that's an attribute of justify with center on it. And remember, this is all on the container, so we're going to justify center. And I'm moving this down to multiple lines because we're going to have a couple different attributes that we're adding. Doesn't seem to be justifying our content. We'll have to look into that. Could be, nope, we've got grid and grid here. So we should be good with the two buttons inside of grid. Maybe it's not calculating the actual margin around H2. Let's worry about our spacing first, and then we'll get to try out the alignment and see what's what there. So we wanted that, and then there's this. Oh, I'm sorry. That's totally my bad. This is what I was trying to adjust, but what we actually want to adjust is this, which is the align items. Ah, man, totally spacing that there. So this needs to be align items. There we go. Now it's lining up. Now, the other one that we want to adjust, like I said, is kind of spacing. So if we come down just a little bit more, I believe they've got an example here where we can adjust it, or was it in, yeah, it's this one. So it's the justify content. We don't want any of these three, but these three are going to kind of give us what we want. And what we really want is this space between. So we're going to set justify to space between. Now if we go over and observe, it's pushed the thing all the way over. Right? So this is actually looking pretty decent at this point. Now it'd be really nice if we had some space between these two items, which we could do by putting another grid around here, so a grid container, and then each one of these being an item. We could potentially do that with some custom CSS styling. It's just up to how we want to handle that. These are also inline elements, so I could potentially add a non-breaking line space here if we wanted to do it really simply. Right, it just adds a little space there. So we'll go ahead and leave that for now, but what we also want to do, I'm going to go ahead and hit edit. We probably want to replicate that here on the edit page. So I'm going to replicate the same thing on the edit page, and then we're going to take a look at what our content layout should be. All right, now we can talk about what it's going to be to set up this space down here. So we want, what we talked about before was having the dragon image on the left and then the content on the right. So what we're looking at is two columns. Now, I'm going to start it at 50-50, and then we're just going to kind of play with how we want it to look. So here on the details, if we section out everything that is the image, so the image is here, right? And then the type and name are here. So we're going to need a little reorganization there. But this is going to become our grid. And it'll be our grid container, right? Outermost wrapping element. That's what we're looking at to be the grid container. And then we need two grid items. I'm not going to put any spacing on them to start, and then any kind of anything there. We're just going to have it be just the content organization. Now I'm going to move the image, which is here, up into the first grid item. Now in the second grid item, we want pretty much all of the other content. Right? So we want all of that in there. So let's move it up a little bit at a time. Alright, so right now it looks like it's stacking, right? This is because we haven't added any actual sizing to it. So it's trying to just sort of inherit what's there. And what's there is a very large image and a lot of content. So we need to give it some sizing. And remember, we're working off of a 12-column grid, and we're going to do the smallest size sizing, which is XS. Now I'm going to go over responsive stuff once we've got a general layout, and then we'll start working with responsive. So XS, and then I want however many columns I want it to span. Like I said, I'm going to start with a 50-50, so it's just going to be XS6 and XS6 down here. Now I also want some spacing, so I'm going to set spacing to 3 because that worked out pretty well on the list page. So we'll come back over, and we can see that we're all split out here. And this is looking a lot sharper. Now one thing that I could potentially add is making these two things, attributes and habitats, span the whole distance down here. But I'm not necessarily guaranteed that each creature is going to fill out the entire area of its said picture. But I can decide whether or not that's a problem to me or whether or not it's a benefit. So let's go ahead back to list and just look at a couple of them with this new layout. Right, so attributes actually overlaps here, so we'd have a bit of a gap. And with the demiguises as well, we'd have a little bit of a gap. And then the kappa, also, this one would actually work out pretty well. And then our kitsune, we'd have a gap on the other side. So again, this just comes down to what's going to be the best flavor for our content here. And of course, we could look for images that more accurately fit the area that we're wanting it to fit on the left-hand side. Or we could potentially size things up, size things down. The 50-50 is not bad, but I'd like it to be a little bit less. So I want image side to be a little bit less. I want the other side, the content side, to be a little bit more. So I'm going to set this to 7, and I'm going to set this to 5. Yeah, now that's looking a little bit more like I would like it to. Let's check out the Ancient Dragon here, who has a lot of content. Yeah, that's looking a little bit nicer, a little bit more sharp. Try a couple more of them. Not so bad. Now, let's say that we want these two to go full width here. Well, we could potentially set up a whole new grid underneath this grid, or we could set up just another grid column. So let's try setting it up by just putting in another grid column. So the grid columns will always wrap. When it reaches the full length of the space, it just wraps the next line down. And what we want is a full width. So of a 12 column grid, if we want something that goes full width, we want it to go 12 columns. So this one's going to go 12 columns, and it's going to take in the attributes and habitats, and attribute and habitats are now full width down here. So I'm kind of setting this up for some future case because the styling on these is going to look vastly different than it does currently. Now, there's some inconsistency with how my text is styled out here. So I really would like to do something where my text is styled out a little bit nicer and consistently across. So while I go ahead and do some of the grid stuff here, be thinking about what I'm doing with the grids, but I want to make sure that I've got not only my details here, but I also have my edit all set up. So let's get the edit set up as well, and we'll move on from there. And with this, we've got grid now and a good consistent layout on all of our pages. Obviously, there's some things that we want to adjust here, but we're going to adjust that when we start talking about forms. So let's go ahead and leave it at here for now, and then please join me again for talking about typography, and then we'll talk another session about forms. Thank you.